Most people think betrayal starts with shouting, but sometimes it starts with a smile. That night, he said one sentence and everything quietly changed.
What he said at that dinner table sounded harmless, but it revealed everything.
The night Edward called his wife replaceable, the entire room went silent. Not because people were shocked, but because Gemma did not react. She did not raise her voice. She did not look angry. She did not even look surprised. She only looked at Edward for a moment, the way someone studies a stranger they thought they knew. Then she smiled, a calm smile, the kind of smile that meant something had quietly ended. Edward Whitmore had always believed he was the architect of his own success. In public, people described him as a brilliant businessman, a rising name in the American logistics industry. His company had grown fast, faster than many expected. Magazines called him bold. Investors called him visionary. Edward called it hard work. But the truth was more complicated than that. Behind the polished image of Edward Whitmore stood a woman who rarely spoke about what she did. Gemma Whitmore. When Edward first met Gemma, he was not the man the world saw now. He was ambitious, yes, but his company was small and unstable. His ideas were big, but his plans often lacked structure. Gemma saw potential where others saw risk. She came from a wealthy American family that owned commercial properties across California and parts of Texas. Her father had built his empire slowly over decades. Her mother ran several luxury boutique hotels. Gemma had grown up around money, but more importantly, she had grown up around discipline. She understood how systems worked. She understood how businesses survived. When Edward shared his dream of building a nationwide logistics company, Gemma listened carefully, not like someone being impressed, like someone studying a blueprint. And slowly, quietly, she began helping. She helped him rewrite his business plan. She introduced him to 2 early investors through her father's network. She organized the company's operations when everything felt chaotic, but she never stepped into the spotlight. Edward's name stayed on every headline, and she was fine with that. In the early years of their marriage, Edward still recognized her value. Sometimes late at night after long days at the office, he would look at her and say things that sounded sincere. "You're the reason this works, Gemma. You see things I miss. You make everything easier." And she believed those words, because at the time they felt true. Back then, Edward was different. He used to ask for her opinion about everything. Before signing contracts, he would sit at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. Gemma would read each page carefully while he paced around the room. "What do you think?" he would ask, and she would point to details he overlooked. "This clause gives them too much control. This delivery timeline is unrealistic. You need to protect your margins here." Edward always listened. At least he did in the beginning. The company started small, just a rented office space and 5 employees trying to make something work. Gemma helped interview the first staff members. She built simple systems to track shipments and payments. She even stayed late at the office some nights organizing files while Edward spoke with clients. But whenever people praised Edward, she stayed quiet. When investors complimented his strategy, she smiled politely. Edward stood in front. Gemma stood behind, and neither of them questioned that arrangement. The first real breakthrough came during the company's 2nd year. Edward secured a contract with a national retail chain that needed large-scale distribution support. It was the kind of deal that could change everything. Edward celebrated like he had already won, but Gemma stayed cautious. "Big contracts come with big responsibility," she told him one evening while reviewing the documents. Edward laughed. "You worry too much." "I plan ahead," she corrected gently. Over the next few weeks, she worked quietly behind the scenes, making sure the company could actually deliver what Edward promised. She reorganized delivery routes. She negotiated better fuel agreements with suppliers. She streamlined employee schedules so shipments would move faster. When the project launched successfully, Edward received the praise. Investors applauded him. Industry magazines wrote about his leadership. Gemma watched quietly from the side, and she was happy, because success for him meant success for both of them. Or at least that was what she believed then. But success has a strange way of changing people. It rarely happened suddenly. It happened slowly. At first, the changes were small. Edward began attending more business conferences in different cities. He appeared in magazine interviews. He started getting invited to private networking dinners with powerful investors. His confidence grew. Then his ego grew with it. The language in their home began to change. Where he once said we, he started saying I. I built this company. I closed that deal. I expanded the network. Gemma noticed the difference immediately, but she did not challenge him. She believed marriages had seasons. Sometimes one partner shines while the other protects the foundation. What she did not realize was that Edward had slowly begun believing the spotlight belonged only to him. 3 years into the company's rapid expansion, Edward hired a new assistant. Her name was Marie Lawson. Marie was young, sharp, and extremely attentive to Edward. She admired everything he said. She laughed loudly at his jokes. She praised his leadership in front of staff and clients. At first, Gemma did not think much about it. Assistants often try to impress their bosses. But over time, small details began to shift. Edward stayed later at the office. His phone buzzed constantly, and when Gemma walked into the room while he was texting, he sometimes turned his screen away. The first moment that truly made Gemma pause happened during a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles. Edward stood near the bar speaking with 2 investors. Marie stood beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. They leaned close when they spoke. They laughed at private comments. Gemma watched quietly from across the room. Her friend Clara, who had known Gemma since college, leaned toward her. "Gemma," Clara whispered gently, "I hope I'm wrong, but that assistant seems very comfortable." Gemma kept her eyes on the room. "Edward hires confident people," she replied calmly. Clara looked unconvinced. But Gemma did not continue the conversation, because even then something inside her was not reacting with jealousy. It was reacting with observation. Over the next few months, Edward's attitude toward Gemma slowly changed. He became impatient. If she asked questions about work, he brushed them off. "You wouldn't understand the pressure. You worry too much. You've never built something at this level." That sentence always hung in the air. Gemma never corrected him, because technically Edward believed it. The night everything shifted happened during a private dinner at their Beverly Hills home. Several investors were visiting from New York. The conversation flowed easily at first. Wine glasses clinked. Business stories filled the room. Then one investor joked about how difficult it was to replace loyal employees. Edward laughed loudly. "Everyone is replaceable," he said confidently. The table chuckled. Edward continued, enjoying the attention. "People think they're special, but business doesn't work like that." Someone raised an eyebrow. "Even family?" the investor joked. Edward shrugged casually. "Even spouses." A few guests laughed awkwardly. Gemma sat beside him quietly. Edward glanced toward her and grinned. "Right, Gemma?" The room waited. Gemma slowly turned toward him. Her voice stayed calm. "Of course." Edward raised his glass proudly. "See? She understands." Gemma studied him for a long moment. Then she said something simple. "If that's true, you should try it." The table went silent. Edward laughed. "Try what?" Gemma took a slow sip of water. "Replace me."
At this point, most people will argue, but she didn't. And that's where everything started to fall apart for him. Tell me, would you have reacted differently?
And for the first time that evening, the laughter stopped completely. The silence at the dinner table stretched longer than anyone expected. Edward leaned back in his chair, letting out a loud laugh like Gemma had just told a harmless joke. "You're being dramatic," he said, waving his hand as if the moment meant nothing. But the room did not laugh with him. Several investors shifted in their seats. One man cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass, but even that small movement sounded loud in the heavy silence. Gemma remained standing, calm, composed. She did not look angry. She did not look embarrassed. If anything, she looked thoughtful. "You said everyone is replaceable," she said softly. Edward shrugged. "That's just reality." Gemma nodded once. "Then you should test it." Edward chuckled again, but this time the sound felt forced. You're taking this too seriously. Gemma pulled her chair back slowly and stood up fully. The movement was graceful, controlled. Enjoy your dinner, she said. No sarcasm, no emotion, just calm politeness. Then she turned and walked upstairs. No one spoke for several seconds. The investors avoided looking at Edward. Edward forced another laugh. My wife has a strange sense of humor, he said, lifting his glass again. But the atmosphere in the room had already changed. The conversation returned slowly, but the warmth was gone. People spoke politely, but no one stayed long. Within 30 minutes, the guests began leaving. Edward shook hands at the door, smiling confidently like nothing unusual had happened. But when the last car disappeared down the long driveway, the house felt unusually quiet. Edward loosened his tie as he walked upstairs. He expected an argument. He expected raised voices, tears, and accusations. That was the usual pattern when couples fought. Instead, he opened the bedroom door and found Gemma calmly folding clothes into a suitcase. Edward stopped in the doorway. What are you doing? Gemma continued folding a dress neatly before answering. Giving you the opportunity you mentioned. Edward frowned. What opportunity? She placed the folded dress inside the suitcase and looked up at him. To replace me. Edward rolled his eyes. Gemma, that was a joke. She studied his face for a moment. No, Edward, it wasn't. He sighed heavily and walked further into the room. You're overreacting. Gemma closed the suitcase halfway and rested her hands on it. No, she said gently. I'm respecting what you said. Edward crossed his arms. My belief? You believe I'm replaceable. Edward gave a short laugh. Everyone is replaceable, that's just life. Gemma nodded slowly. Yes. She zipped the suitcase completely. So I'm stepping aside. Edward stared at her. You're leaving because of one comment? Gemma shook her head. No. She paused before continuing. I'm leaving because you meant it. Edward opened his mouth to argue, but the calm certainty in her voice made the words feel useless. Gemma lifted the suitcase from the bed. Edward felt irritation rising. This is ridiculous. She walked past him toward the door. You'll come back in a week, Edward added dismissively. Gemma paused at the doorway. Then she turned slightly and looked at him. We'll see. And she left. The house felt strangely empty after the sound of the front door closed. For the first few days, Edward enjoyed the silence. No questions. No reminders about meetings. No discussions about schedules or responsibilities. He ordered takeout instead of eating the carefully planned meals Gemma used to organize. He worked late without explaining himself, and Marie began appearing more often. At first, she stayed late at the office helping him finish reports and contracts. Then they started having dinners together after work. Marie admired Edward openly. You're incredible, you know that? She said one evening while they sat at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. Edward smiled. People say that. Marie leaned forward with excitement in her eyes. No, I mean it. You built all this yourself. The words felt good, very good. They reminded Edward of the image he had created for the world. A man who built everything with his own hands. Marie eventually began spending nights at his house. Not officially moving in, but staying often enough that it slowly became normal. She laughed easily. She complimented him constantly, and she never questioned his decisions. Edward convinced himself everything was fine. Gemma had left. Life moved on, just like he said it would. But slowly, small cracks began appearing. The first problem arrived with the bills. Edward opened a stack of envelopes one afternoon and realized several property payments were overdue. He frowned. Gemma had always handled those things. Marie, he called from his office. She walked in, scrolling through her phone. Yes. Did you pay the property taxes for the Palm Springs house? Marie blinked. I thought accounting handled that. Edward rubbed his forehead. Gemma used to coordinate it. Marie shrugged casually. Well, I'm not Gemma. Edward dismissed it quickly. I'll handle it. But more issues followed. A meeting with investors was scheduled incorrectly. A shipment contract missed an important deadline. 2 employees complained about confusion in their instructions. Edward found himself spending hours fixing problems that had never appeared before. Meanwhile, Marie's behavior slowly began to change. At first, she admired everything about Edward, but as time passed, the admiration softened. She still smiled, but she stopped praising him constantly. Instead, she began avoiding responsibility. "Why is the investor call canceled?" Edward asked one morning. Marie shrugged. "I thought someone else confirmed it." Edward frowned. Gemma used to double-check these things. Marie rolled her eyes slightly. "Well, Gemma isn't here." The sentence stayed in the air longer than either of them expected. And for the first time since Gemma left, Edward felt something uncomfortable in his chest. Not regret, not yet, just a quiet awareness. Something important had quietly disappeared from his life. But Edward was not ready to admit that yet, because admitting it would mean facing a truth he had ignored for too long. That some people do not make noise while holding everything together. And when they leave, the silence begins to reveal everything. At first, Edward convinced himself the problems were temporary. Businesses always face challenges. Schedules could be corrected. Employees could be replaced. Mistakes could be fixed. That was the rule Edward had always believed. Everything had a solution if you applied enough pressure. But the truth that slowly revealed itself was far more uncomfortable. Some problems were not loud, they were quiet, and quiet problems had a strange way of growing in the background until they became impossible to ignore. The structure of Edward's life had quietly depended on someone who was no longer there. Gemma had never announced what she handled. She never made speeches about her contributions. She simply did things. Now every missing piece began revealing itself one by one. The house itself was the first place where Edward noticed the change. The staff seemed confused more often. The cleaning schedules overlapped. Maintenance requests piled up without resolution. One morning, the head housekeeper approached Edward carefully during breakfast. "Mr. Whitmore," she said politely, "should we continue preparing for the charity dinner this month?" Edward looked up from his phone. "What charity dinner?" The woman hesitated. "The one Mrs. Whitmore hosted every month for the Children's Hospital Foundation." Edward blinked. "I didn't know about that." The housekeeper looked surprised. "Mrs. Whitmore organized it personally." Edward felt a strange irritation rise in his chest. "Cancel it," he said quickly. The woman nodded and left the room. But the moment lingered in his mind longer than he expected. There were parts of Gemma's life he had never paid attention to, and now those parts were quietly disappearing. At the office, the situation was even worse. Edward's logistics company had grown quickly over the years, but behind that growth had been systems and structures Gemma quietly helped design. She had reviewed contracts. She had checked operational reports. She had noticed small inconsistencies before they turned into expensive mistakes. Without her presence, those details slipped through unnoticed. Then those details turned into real problems. One afternoon, Edward received a phone call from one of his largest investors. Then those details turned into real problems. One afternoon, Edward received a phone call from one of his largest investors. The man's voice sounded serious. "Edward, we need to talk about the quarterly projections." Edward leaned back in his chair. "What about them?" "There are inconsistencies." Edward frowned. "Inconsistencies where?" "The shipment data doesn't match the revenue reports." Edward quickly opened the documents on his computer. "That must be a clerical mistake." "Maybe," the investor replied calmly. "But there are several." Edward felt irritation rising. "I'll have my team fix it." The call ended politely, but the tension remained. Edward immediately called Marie into his office. She walked in holding a coffee cup. "Yes?" "Did you review the financial reports before they were sent to investors?" Marie glanced at the screen briefly. "I assumed the finance department checked them." Edward rubbed his temples. "Gemma used to verify these things." Marie sighed. "Edward, you keep comparing everything to Gemma." Edward froze for a moment. "I'm not comparing. Marie crossed her arms. It sounds like you are. The conversation ended quickly after that, but the uncomfortable feeling stayed in Edward's mind. Over the next 2 months, more cracks appeared. 2 senior employees resigned. Both had worked with Edward since the early years of the company. Their departure surprised him. One of them sent a short explanation in his exit email. Operations have become disorganized. Communication is unclear. Edward felt insulted reading the message, but deep down he knew something had changed. Meetings were less structured. Deadlines were being missed. Departments were not coordinating properly. And Edward suddenly found himself solving problems he had never noticed before. At home, Marie had also begun changing. When Gemma first left, Marie admired Edward constantly. Now that admiration seemed to fade slowly. She spent more time scrolling through her phone. She went out more often with friends. She showed less interest in Edward's work. One evening, Edward sat at the dining table reviewing documents, while Marie watched television in the living room. "You work too much," she said casually without looking up. Edward sighed. "I'm running a company." Marie shrugged. "You act like everything will collapse if you stop working." Edward looked at her. "You used to admire my ambition." Marie laughed lightly. That was when things were exciting. The words stayed in Edward's mind longer than he expected. Another night, during an argument about finances and company stress, Marie said something even worse. "I thought you were more stable than this." Edward stared at her. "What does that mean?" Marie leaned against the kitchen counter. "You talk like you control everything," she said. "But lately, everything looks messy." Edward felt anger rising. "You didn't say that before." Marie shrugged. "Well, things change." That night, Edward could not sleep. He walked through the quiet halls of the large house. The place still looked beautiful, but something about it felt different. Empty. Not physically empty. Emotionally empty. He stopped in the hallway where several framed photographs hung on the wall. Pictures from earlier years. Edward and Gemma at business events. Edward and Gemma at charity galas. Edward and Gemma during vacations in Italy and New York. He studied one photo longer than the others. It showed them standing at a company celebration during the early years. Edward stood in the center, smiling proudly. Gemma stood slightly behind him, smiling gently, supporting the moment without trying to take it. Edward suddenly noticed something strange. In almost every photo on the wall, Gemma stood slightly behind him, never pushing forward, never demanding attention, just quietly present. For the first time since she left, Edward allowed himself to think about her honestly. Not as the woman who walked away, but as the woman who had quietly held his world together. He sat down in his office chair slowly, and for the first time in months he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. What if Gemma had never needed him as much as he believed? What if she had simply chosen him? The thought unsettled him more than he expected, because if that was true, then losing her was not an accident. It was a consequence, and consequences, unlike mistakes, were much harder to undo. 6 months after Gemma walked out of the Beverly Hills house, Edward finally reached a moment he could not ignore. Another investor had withdrawn funding. The explanation had been polite but clear. The investor mentioned concerns about operational instability and delayed communication. Edward read the message twice before closing his laptop slowly. For years, investors had praised his leadership. Now they were questioning it. The company was not collapsing, but it was no longer running smoothly. Problems that once seemed invisible were now appearing everywhere. Employees needed constant direction. Departments complained about confusion. Decisions that used to feel easy now felt heavy. Edward sat alone in his office late that evening, staring out the large window at the city lights. The same city that once celebrated him. The same city that now felt strangely distant. Marie had gone out with friends hours earlier without telling him where she was going. That had become normal lately. At first, she used to ask him if he wanted to come along. Now she simply left. Edward barely noticed when the pattern changed. But tonight, the empty house felt louder than usual. He walked slowly through the hallway. The house still looked perfect. The furniture was polished. The floors were spotless, but something about the atmosphere felt hollow. He passed the dining room where they once hosted business dinners. He remembered the night everything changed. The words still echoed in his mind. Everyone is replaceable. At the time, he believed it completely. He believed success came from strength and independence. He believed relying on people made you weaker. But now he was beginning to understand something different. Some people were not loud about their value. They did not demand recognition. They simply made life easier. And when they disappeared, everything became harder. Edward returned to his office and sat down. His phone rested on the desk. Gemma's number still existed in his contacts. He had never deleted it. Several times during the past months he had considered calling, but pride had stopped him. Tonight felt different, not because he believed he deserved forgiveness, but because he finally understood something simple. Gemma had never been the problem. Edward stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he picked it up. His finger hovered over the contact name. He hesitated. For years he had been the confident one, the man with answers, the man with control, but pressing that call button felt strangely difficult. Finally, he did it. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then Gemma answered. "Hello." Her voice sounded calm, peaceful. Edward swallowed before speaking. "Gemma, it's me." A short silence followed. "Yes, Edward." He struggled to find the right words. "I was wondering if we could talk." "We are talking," she replied gently. Edward leaned back in his chair. "I was wondering if we could talk." "We are talking," she replied gently. Edward leaned back in his chair. "I mean talk properly." Another pause. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm well." Her tone was simple, not cold. Not emotional, just calm. Edward cleared his throat. "What have you been doing these past months?" "Working." Edward felt curious. "Working where?" "I started my own company." Edward blinked in surprise. "You started a company? What kind of consulting?" "Yes." "What kind of company?" "Business consulting." Edward leaned forward slightly. "I help companies organize their operations and improve efficiency." Edward let out a quiet breath. "That sounds familiar." Gemma did not respond immediately. Edward continued carefully. "Is it successful?" "Yes." "How long did it take you to build it?" "About 4 months." Edward closed his eyes briefly. 4 months. It had taken him years to reach the stability he once had, and she had built something new in 4 months. "Gemma," he said slowly, "I think I made a mistake." The silence on the phone lasted longer this time. Then she asked a simple question. "How is the replacement working?" Edward felt the words land heavily. Marie's voice echoed in his memory. Her laughter, her excitement during the early days. Then her criticism, her boredom, her indifference. Edward answered honestly. "Not well." Gemma did not sound surprised. Edward continued speaking quietly. "I thought life would continue the same way." "Yes," she said. "That's what you said that night." Edward exhaled slowly. "I was arrogant." "Yes." There was no anger in her voice, just agreement. Edward looked around his office again. The room that once felt powerful now felt small. "I didn't understand what you were doing for me," he admitted. Gemma responded calmly. "You didn't need to understand." Edward frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You only needed to respect it." The sentence stayed in the air. Edward swallowed again. "Gemma, do you think we could try again?" The silence stretched longer than before. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded gentle. "Edward, some lessons fix people." He waited. "But some lessons only reveal them." Edward felt a slow weight settle in his chest. "Gemma, you believed I was replaceable," she said softly. Edward closed his eyes. "Yes." "And I believed you." Another pause followed. Edward felt something he rarely experienced, helplessness. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Yes," Gemma replied. Edward's voice dropped even lower. Can we fix this? Gemma spoke slowly. Edward, value is easy to ignore when it is present. She paused. But absence teaches clearly. Edward sat silently. For the first time in years, the confident businessman who believed he controlled everything felt very small. He had built an empire, but he had lost the one person who quietly held it together. And somewhere across the country, Gemma sat peacefully in the office of the company she built alone. Not angry, not bitter, just free. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson does not come from revenge. Sometimes it comes from absence. And sometimes people only understand the value of someone when they finally have to live without them.
Sometimes the loudest lesson isn't revenge, it's absence. So tell me, do you think Edward learned too late? Or was Gemma right to walk away? Let me know in the comments section. And if you enjoy stories like this, please do not forget to like and subscribe. See you later. Bye.